is something that you can fall back on. It's something that we can keep for posterity. Some of those great slides are detailed enough, so there is no message lost in a translation, even if you have to revisit it down the road. After the webinar, I will work with the organizers, and we'll have a copy available for you. So today, we're going to be looking at organizational effectiveness as one of the key drivers behind successful organizations. So what makes that organization successful typically in today's world is their ability to translate their strategy into reality. And that's going to be mainly driven by their capabilities to build very strong target operating models, starting with the organizational design and governance, understanding the future of work. So making sure that they're building the organization for tomorrow, not for the yesterday's problems, managing effectively the change management, talent management, and leadership, most importantly. And all this needs to be continuously measured, revisited, and tracked in order to ensure that the performance management is going to lead to necessarily interventions. So a little bit about my background. I have started off my career in HR. I've been working for the organization that has been focused mainly on the business process outsourcing. And I would definitely, I'm just getting some technical messages to zoom in. Can you guys see, this is the maxed out screen, so just want to make sure that everybody can see it in a fine detail right now.
Yes, well, it's clear.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. No worries. So yeah, so I was saying that I started off my career in a business process outsourcing outfit, working with the Fortune 500 companies in US and Canada. And that gave me quite a bit of exposure to industry, understanding what makes or breaks successful businesses. And a lot has to do with people. And in 2007, I have been introduced to Do Telecom. Out of all places, it was at a time a telecom startup in Dubai. I was, quite interested in learning more about this really adventurous place. Dubai, heard so much about it before, but I've never had opportunity to work. And I was brought on board for a 3-month contract to help them with their talent management and talent acquisition. One thing led to another, and 12 years later, I'm still here in the region. I have been blessed to work with a large enterprise startups. So I've spent several years working in Saudi Arabia, working with Sadara Petrochemical. It's probably today the largest petrochemical startup worldwide. Over $25 billion has been invested between Dow Chemical and Aramco. More recently, I have been working with Emirates Nuclear Energy. It's a peaceful nuclear energy program here in Abu Dhabi. And all along, I have been holding advisory positions. So helping these organizations really translate what's their future capability going to look like on the ground by making sure that all these building blocks come in place. So that's a little bit about me. So to be quite frank with you, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And what I would expect from the audience is to make it as interactive as possible. So I have worked very closely with hosts to make sure that you guys can raise your hand, you can ask the questions. So what I would like to do is to measure the success of this webinar if we have managed to really tackle a couple of real-life business problems that you guys are facing, and I can help you with some advice how to address it from the organizational effectiveness plethora of solutions. Now, speaking of that plethora of solutions, so here is a really good visual on what the organizational effectiveness means in today's business world. So obviously, everything is going to start with a problem. So those transformations are usually driven by the need for the digital or some sort of business ignition, perhaps by a merger or acquisition. There is a need for the cultural transformation or a performance turnaround. And one of the first things that's going to happen once the strategy is updated and you end up with that beautiful, colorful deck on your desk, here's our vision for next 5 years. This is what the strategy is going to look like. Most of us in HR start, scratching our head and like trying to figure out what are the next steps. So most of the time, this is going to lead to the change of the governance, roles and responsibility, or the delegation of the authority. And most importantly, we have to start looking into the organizational structure to figure out, do we have fit for purpose organizational design that's really going to be aligned with the future state processes, technology landscape, and most importantly, people capabilities. This is going to be followed by the people effectiveness. So from the organizational effectiveness, where we spend the lion's share of time, is making sure that we move the needle in the right direction when it comes to organizational preparedness for the change, but most importantly, improving the productivity of our employees. And this is very much going to be driven by the people effectiveness, not necessarily efficiency. So it's really important to highlight that there is a really deep divide between effectiveness. So doing the right things and doing things the right way. So what we do in organizational effectiveness is make sure that we have the right people in the right jobs doing the right thing. And then over the time, efficiency is going to kick in, making sure that the productivity is further enhanced through that aspect. And all this is going to come together through change enablement. So we got to make sure that we're prepared as an organization to effectively manage the change. As you can probably see from the most recent experiences driven by this pandemic, I'm pretty sure that organizations that have prepared well ahead of the time and put into their business planning some scenarios, as well as understand how to effectively manage the change. This transition from in-office to work from home is really not gonna have a significantly negative impact on them. On the other side of the spectrum, those organizations that were not really paying attention to their change enablement capabilities will pay dearly. So now just over to you. I was wondering if we can gauge some feedback from the audience in terms of organizational effectiveness. More often than not, I find that this is a quite hazy term, and it means different things for different people. I would just like to get a bit of confirmation if we're moving in the right direction and if this is in line in terms of what you have been expecting out of this webinar. Any thoughts? Anybody would like to share something? I see Sultan. Sultan, what are your thoughts? I think you have to be unmuted by our administrators. I'm not sure how that works. Let me just get this fixed as soon as possible. Can we get some questions? Okay, fair enough. Let's progress. I'll leave it to our technical team to figure out how we're gonna get the audience involved. But it would be really great if we can make sure that you guys can ask questions so it works for everybody. Let me just get this aside. Okay, fair enough. So back to our agenda, we'll look into the organizational design. And I just want to contextualize this a bit. This is the masterclass that typically goes for 3 days. So I have condensed, and I'm gonna give you a bit of a overview of all the major points and the major content. But you can imagine this is a quite broad subject, and it's very difficult to cover it as much as possible in such a short period of time. So I see a question here. What is the difference between organizational effectiveness for SME and corps? I like sometimes if you can talk, if you have reward for OD as a part of the organizational effectiveness. So let me just answer the first question in terms of the difference between the small and medium-sized enterprises and large corporations. If I understood the question correctly, mainly it's going to be the difference in terms of the volume. But in terms of the methodology and approaches, they're quite universal, and they should be applicable across the board. When it comes to next question, in terms of the rewards and OD as part of the organizational effectiveness, of course, rewards are an intricate part of the organizational design, and I will discuss this in much greater detail in the next few slides, because ultimately we have to make sure that we're incentivizing the right behaviors for the organization, and most importantly, that the leadership is using this vehicle, total rewards, for the benefit of the organization, and most importantly, for driving the retention of the top talent and rewarding the high performers. So I see there is another comment from Abdelaziz. Yes, and thank you so much for sharing this. Yeah, I think it's a real difference of impact if you have the capability to translate this theory and the academic perspectives on the organizational effectiveness into real life interventions that lead to some business results that are tangible and people can put a finger on it. But ultimately, as you will see through this presentation, it has to do a lot with the change enablement. So making sure that the change management is really effective and it empowers the stakeholders at every level of the organization through communication, but most importantly, through delegation of the authority to make a difference. So just going back to Mohammed, yes, so the approach is going to be more relevant than volume in some cases, but mostly volume is going to be different. But in terms of the approach, I would like to think, at least from my humble perspective, it's quite universal. So let's progress. I hope I have managed to answer the questions. So let's look at the different design frameworks when it comes to the OD. One thing that's really, really important is that we have to make sure that we have the right organizational design framework in place. And why is this important? For the sheer fact that if we don't have the organizational design framework, then everything goes. And I'm pretty sure you guys have experienced this in your own organizations. Organizational design and the restructuring is usually, quite a politically sensitive topic, and it drives organization to the extremes if there is no methodology, if there is no data-driven approach, an empirical approach to making decisions. If you don't have the baseline rules, then it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very subjective how we make decisions when it comes to organizational restructuring. So what I wanted to do with this slide is to showcase what are the most prevalent options when it comes to organizational design frameworks. So typically, we'll be looking at one of these options. If you are in the Middle East, you're very likely in a large organization to work with McKinsey. They have their world famous 7S, published in 80s. And ultimately, it's a really good model for reviewing the performance of the organization and driving the change in the organization. Boozell and Hamilton, as you can see, there is a common theme. A lot of these frameworks have been developed by the management consultancies. That's part of their nature of the business. They drive these restructuring interventions on the back of the strategy implementation. So going back to the Boozell and Hamilton, they're looking at the natural business units. It's a decision-making process that can help you understand the drivers behind the centralization and decentralization decisions, the relationship between the corporate center and the rest of the organization. At the same time, we have balanced scorecards. More often than not, balanced scorecards are used for the corporate performance management, but believe it or not, from the academic perspective, they also do have a quite pragmatic application in the organizational design and the decision-making when it comes to organizational restructuring. Then you will find concurrence model, Concurrence model is typically used by Oliver Wyman or Mercer. If you have worked with them, I'm pretty sure you came across this methodology. I have had experience with the concurrence model, and to be honest with you, I find it a bit more academic and fairly complex to grasp in a short period of time. So I will also share with you pros and cons for different methodologies. I see a question here from Mohammed. What about the HAY methodology? HAY methodology typically refers to job sizing and job evaluation. So they are more focused on how you reward people rather than how do you structure the organization. So the model that I personally really find quite enduring is Jay Galbraith's STAR model. And even McKinsey's 7S has been based on the Jay Galbraith's model. And in the next slides, I will share much more detail on how this model really works. And I'm trying to balance between the content I'm presenting and the questions. I just want to make sure that I satisfy both. So I see here a question, can I ask if you're familiar with a family business in the KSA and what do you normally follow? So as I said, my preferred model is usually going to be either Jay Galbraith's STAR model or Gould Campbell's model. So just before I go to the Gould Campbell's model, there is also BCG. They have a fairly good and robust design approach. So 4 building blocks, including identifying the right business issues, pinpointing the right underlying obstacles, and adopting the right design characteristics. So what all of these models have in common is ultimately the framework is set in such a way that's going to take you through a standardized approach where you're going to discover, design, and agree on particular outcomes in a structured fashion. So it's just a set of questions, the way you're going to demystify this whole thing when it comes to organizational design. All these frameworks are basically a roster of questions that you need to answer in order to come to a particular conclusion. What's really going to bring this to life is your ability to make it an exercise that's going to be facilitated by HR, but ultimate decision makers are going to be your business stakeholders. And the best processes are really going to lead to a co-designing environment. So making sure that all the stakeholders have the right of say, they make a meaningful contribution, but most importantly, they all play along the set of rules that have been adopted even before we start the work. So that's the most important thing. So if there is something that I would like to leave you with before we move to the next slide, is regardless of which framework you use, regardless of the methodology you adopt, make sure you have a methodology. That's the most important thing, because that set of rules is going to give you the discipline to transform your organization. So here is the outline of the Jay Galbraith's STAR model. So essentially, this model is built around the 5 dimensions. So it's looking at the strategy that's going to ultimately help you build a set of rules for design of the organization, your design policy or your design principles. And that's going to lead to a development of the structure. That structure typically can fall into any of those 5 basic structure options. So you might be looking at the organization that's going to be oriented towards the functional setup, product structure, market structure, geography, or process structure. And this is going to be very, very much customized to your particular situation. So depending on what your strategy is, what your external environment is all about, the size of the organization, the culture of the organization, the type of the industry that you operate in, is very much going to drive the archetype of the organizational structure that you will adhere. And then we're going to be looking at the policies of driving the process design. So what's going to be the next step in the STAR model when it comes to organizational design is once you agree on the archetype of the organizational structure, and you're going to always start from the top down. So once you establish your primary axis, the CEO's office, with the top of the organization and all the CXO's reporting structures, you will start looking into the processes to make sure that you are cascading your organizational design. And ultimately, this is where all the tough decisions need to happen. You know, is this process going to be owned within the single vertical? Is this a cross-functional process? How are the decisions going to be made? Who's going to be responsible, accountable, or informed party? This is happening at this particular junction. And then going back to the earlier question, we got to start looking at the rewards. So how are you going to make sure that the engine keeps turning? How do you make sure that the right behaviors are rewarded in the organization? You got to make sure that you have the right total rewards policies and procedures that will drive the expected outcomes. And then the final bit when it comes to the Galbraith STAR model is going to be around people, obviously. So regardless of the expected outcome, you have to make sure that you are constantly keeping an eye on a ball, meaning that you are aware of your people's capabilities, their levels of the engagement, their level of happiness in the organization is really important. And making sure that you are building the organization not necessarily around the people, but for the people. Because there is no point of coming up with a structure that will ultimately be very difficult to execute due to the lack of the talent, due to the lack of the budgets to acquire such talent required for the processes that we have planned for. So what's going to really happen when it comes to people as an organization? You have to also understand that this is going to be an iterative process. So it's not going to be a linear process where you're going to come up with something that's going to finish in a fairly short period of time and it's going to be cast in stone. So the organizational design, one of the things you need to account for, has to have a certain degree of flexibility to manage those contingency plans. I hope this makes sense so far for you guys. And I would like to just give you a bit of more information when it comes to these different elements from the perspective of detail. It's really important that you capture the framework in your policies and procedures. So one of the things that I have seen in many organizations, especially in the startup environment or organizations that are typically very well established, so on the both sides of the extreme, they fail to really articulate the methodology within their organizational redesign policy and procedure. So there is a lot of verbiage in their policies that talk about how do you move one box to the next level, how do you restructure, but they don't really talk about the framework. What is the decision process going to look like? And why are you going to make a decision to go left versus right? And this is where the frameworks come in. This is the real importance of articulating your preferred approach when it comes to organizational design and embedding it into the process. Because without that piece, all the other stuff that you might have in your procedures is really not going to do you much good. Because if the leaders do not understand really the decision-making process, it's going to be a bit of a hassle for everybody to get aligned. So typically what we like to discuss for each of these methodologies with our clients, what are the pros and cons, you know? So for the STAR model, you know, the obvious pros are, you know, a description of the important organization elements. So this methodology is quite holistic. It covers, you know, most of the important success factors, and it's, you know, recognition of the interaction between these elements. So the connection that you can drive between the people, structure, processes, rewards is quite effective in the STAR model. One of the shortcomings that really stands out is no performance variables. So when it comes to STAR model, and this is a quite obvious shortcoming for most of the frameworks, it's quite difficult to understand when the organizational structure is due for the restructuring. So in terms of keeping a tab on understanding the performance of the organization is not quite clear. And some of the elements that could be added on top of what we have seen is also an opportunity for improvement of this model. And in some of the variations of the model, I have seen, for instance, organizational culture. So structure is very much going to be impacted, obviously, by your strategy. But the other level, the other input that's really, really important is going to be the organizational culture. So making sure that you really understand what is the culture in your organization, because at the end of the day, you know, that famous saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, I don't necessarily agree with it. I think that culture and strategy go hand in hand. Culture is the key enabler of your strategy. So you really have to make a good call on understanding what your current culture is all about. So once we understand what is the landscape of organizational design frameworks, let's see how do we start, you know, the heavy lifting and make sure that we do the right thing when it comes to the redesign. So typically, this is the part that has to be very clear at the onset of the project. So make sure that you really mobilize your organization in the right direction by articulating step-by-step list of the activities that will entail in restructuring of your organization. So obviously, it's really going to come down to these three broad categories: building a case. So employees as well as the leaders need to be on the same page. Why are we doing this? So you need to build a very strong, easy to understand and articulate problem statement. What are you trying to fix? You know that saying, you know, don't fix something that's not broken. And I have seen so many organizations fall into that trap of perpetual restructuring and trying to figure out how to get somebody promoted, and that leads to yet another restructuring on the business unit, functional, or even section level, and it's just a very painful process. That degree of ambiguity for the employees that don't know really what's happening, and most importantly, why is this happening, is really stressful. So to avoid these issues, start building a very strong business case. Start interacting with your senior leaders as well as your operational leaders to understand why is this restructuring required? What's the key driver? You know, and along the way, make sure that you recognize key challenges and measure the degree of the employee engagement as well as the performance. So that's going to be really important. So before you start, make sure that you take the level of assessment that's going to give you a good insight in terms of the current level of the employee happiness and engagement, and then start looking into this variation over a period of time. The next step is going to be assessment of the workflows in the organization. So understanding how your company really delivers results through their organizational setup. So making sure that you map out core activities that you understand, and this again is very specific. It goes from industry to industry. So some industries like high reliability organizations, such as companies operating in a healthcare, petrochemical, nuclear, or energy, or oil and gas, they're very regulated. So in terms of understanding the processes, it's part of the health and safety and regulatory and compliance requirements. So there is not really much room for change. Ultimately, it leads to a fairly straightforward processes when it comes to organizational design. On the other side of the spectrum, other lines of business are much more flexible, much more fluid. So some of the ICT companies that I have worked with, some of the software development companies, they tend to have a very flat structure. They tend to be quite nimble, and that's where things get hazy. When you start to wrap your head around what's happening, how you get things done, you will find out. And also in the smaller organizations, a lot of these processes are driven by individuals. You know, this person pretty much knows how this happens and it's all up here. And that's not really a good shape to be in if you as an organization want to build a sustainable operation. So making sure that you analyze your workflows, develop maps, understand the productivity level of different processes is going to be the next step. Because ultimately you need to make sure that whatever you're building is going to be an improvement. You don't damage the existing performance. And then you can start looking into a design criteria, aligning it with your business drivers. So evaluate the structure and processes regularly. Focus on forecasting organizational design needs based on the misalignments identified. So start looking at those derailers in your organization that's going to have a negative impact. So typically what is happening in organizations, there is usually a pretty good way to identify that it's the right time to start looking into organizational redesign if your spans of control are off, or if the shape of the organization is getting bent out. So what I'm trying to say here, a lot of organizations fall into that trap of uncontrolled promotions. So you end up having an inverted pyramid, a top-heavy organization that's not necessarily very financially viable. And most importantly, it leads to a very narrow span of control. So you will have managers with very few direct subordinates. It creates a silo mentality. And what I have seen, the biggest challenge here is not necessarily the organizational ineffectiveness. It's actually the culture that deteriorates, because our companies that have a very top-heavy setup tend to be silo-oriented. You will find a lot of politics in these kind of organizations, and it becomes very difficult to work. So make sure that as an HR professional, you build some sort of control mechanism in your organizational effectiveness practices to continuously monitor those performance indicators. So now here we are expanding a bit on all of these individual steps, making sure that, again, you have a structured approach, that you have a fairly collaborative approach when it comes to understanding the workflows in the organization and designing the criteria around your business drivers. So when it comes to the management of the workflows, I think this is an interesting area, because lately there are quite a few advancements when it comes to the process management. So now it's not only about, you know, person to person, you know, person to machine kind of a relationship. Now in most of the business environments, we're facing an expansion of the robotic process automation. We see that big data is kicking in with a lot of opportunities to drive process improvements and effectiveness through business intelligence. So the business environment is getting significantly smarter and more complex for HR professionals as well as organizational effectiveness advisors, because now the relationships are expanding beyond the norm, and you have to account for different elements of the processes that can be completely automated, that can be rapidly outsourced, that can be actually completely removed from the organizational performance. And that degree of complexity is very much going to be minimized through understanding the future of work, as well as understanding the technology evolution. So now more than ever, and obviously I commend you on your investment in time to participate in this webinar, we really need to be on the cutting edge by continuously learning, you know. So that fact that we have to be lifelong learners is really, really becoming a reality. And, you know, if you don't stay on top of things, within like 24 months, you can really be a dinosaur. And some industries obviously change more rapidly than the others, but what's really important is to invest the time in understanding the evolution of the technology and how this evolution is going to impact the workplace. And then designing the structure. This is really going to be an area that is going to require more than a technical knowledge. So rather than to just share with you some of my technical experiences, I would like to share some of my personal experiences. So what really makes a successful transformation of the organizational structure is your ability to navigate the political landscape. So managing alliances, understanding the change management success factors, change readiness in the organization, and culture is extremely important. And this is one of the areas of organizational effectiveness where that rule, you know, plan 70% of the time and then execute 30% is really, really relevant. Shall we have larger size of the slides? This is the size, it's maximized. I'm really sorry, I can't really zoom in more. We'll share slides with you and then you can review them at your own discretion if that's gonna help. I hope that's gonna work for everybody. So what I'm trying to say here, when you are moving into the organizational transformation, make sure that the first step, which is understanding the landscape you're operating in, is really covered thoroughly. So make sure that you spend quite a bit of time in mapping your stakeholders, assessing your stakeholders, understanding their ambition, their agenda, their performance levels, and most importantly, understanding the history. And that's really going to set you on the path of success. So having a strong technical background and understanding how to effectively execute the frameworks is only 30 to 40% of your success. The other 60% is going to be your understanding how to manage the political landscape. However, without these technical 40%, you will never be able to manage the whole exercise only with the politically savvy approach. So here's another question. Where to fit organizational effectiveness, attract, develop, sustain? Good question. So I'll give you a bit of a story on that topic as well. I think it's quite relevant. So on the back of this point about making sure to navigate the political landscape, more and more I have seen that organizational effectiveness and organizational design is moving closer to strategy department. Due to its proximity to strategy, I think this might not be such a bad idea. However, you know, this doesn't necessarily work very well for every organization. But when you ask me where would I put the organizational effectiveness, I think the natural inclination is going to be in HR. So it has to have a very strong elements of organizational design, organizational development, talent management, change management. So depending of your current structure, I would see it sitting with the OD, obviously with a direct reporting line to your chief level role in HR. Alternatively, as I suggested, it could be in the strategy department. So when it comes to organizational design alignment review, these are really great opportunities to have on a regular basis. So some of the things that I typically suggest to organization is you have two ways of looking at organizational design. It can be trigger-based or it can be conducted on the regular intervals. I would be honest with you, and I would say that typically I would go for the both options because it does not make much sense to completely ignore a trigger-based option. And a trigger-based option is a significant change in the business, and that would be a rollout of the new strategy, some sort of climatic change in the business environment, or a performance issue that will be triggering the need for the organizational change. On the other side, you're going to have an interval-based assessment of the organization. So let's say every 6 months, you're going to look at your organizational KPIs, spans of control. You're going to look at elements such as ratios between managers and staff. You're going to look at that tooth-to-tail ratio between the core and the support functions, making sure that numbers add up, that this is also in line in terms of your expected productivity KPIs. And that's a really good health check every 6 months, making sure that understanding that in some industries this might be more frequent or less frequent depending on the nature of the business. Can we say that organizational design is part from a change management? Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. Change management is definitely playing a significant a success role in organizational design, and OD as a business unit has to have this capability. So to be quite frank with you, I think that change management is the most relevant capability to OD, although you will find it in other areas of the business. But I think those big seismic changes are usually triggered by the organizational restructuring. So just to give you a bit of a input also, I have like an 80-page slide deck here, so please don't hold it against me if I skim through some of them, because as I said, they're quite text rich, and I would like to keep this within the prescribed time. So one thing that's really important is to make sure that you have a very good approach when it comes to understanding the benefits and the outcomes of the organizational restructuring. So making sure that you have a very clear expectation from the initiator of the change. Why are we making this change? What's the degree of feasibility? So what's the extent of the alignment with the organizational culture, availability of the talent? As I have suggested earlier, there is no point of going into restructuring only to find out that you don't have the requisite talent in the organization. So to give you a direct answer to the question, is OD transformation impacting productivity directly? Absolutely. And I'll give you a real life example. In organizations where you have processes that are dependent on the effective management, if you change the organizational structure where you're going to increase the number of management jobs, and that will force your hand to promote people that are not necessarily ready for the management role, that will have a negative impact on your productivity. And if you look at the productivity from the perspective of the return on investment in human capital, that will also be very much organizational design driven. So what is the return on investment in human capital? So that's the amount of money that you invest in your people over the ultimate number, which is your revenue. So how much money are you generating for your organization over the investment you're making in your workforce? So the total cost of the workforce. So through different organizational design interventions, you can minimize the number of people that will be required to execute your processes. So introducing, as I said, automation, that's going to lead to a significant improvement in productivity. When it comes to effectiveness and efficiency, also organization that has a flat structure, that has fewer layers, tend to be more effective. So let's look at it from the perspective of the culture of safety. I'm pretty sure many of you come from either oil and gas or industries that are heavily regulated due to the criticality of the operations. So can you imagine having a petrochemical plant that has like 10 or 11 layers? So if there is a critical instance on the shop floor, you need to go through 11 levels of the chain of command before it's escalated to the CEO. That's absolutely unacceptable. So as you probably know, these high reliability organizations tend to be quite flat with no more than 4 or 5 layers. And that's really gonna help them drive the productivity as well. So in case you need to manage rapidly the change of the direction, it's gonna be much easier for you. So you will be able to communicate and articulate the expectations more effectively, communicating through 4 or 5 layers in the organization versus 11 layers in the organization. You can imagine, you know, as executive, it might be quite frustrating trying to articulate a change in direction, and it has to go to a VP, from a VP to executive director, from executive director to director, and so on and so on. By the time it gets to a staffers, they're like, what the hell is going on? You know, I don't even understand what the strategy is all about. So the other element is going to be cost. So obviously organizations in tough times, I was just going over the price of oil this morning, you know, and that's not quite encouraging. Companies in these times of very rapid change when it comes to pricing of the commodities are going to be cost wary. So making sure that we understand the total cost of the ownership of that future structure is going to be really important. And this is something that we tend to minimize or very easily overlook. So when we're talking about a total cost of the ownership of the future state organization, we need to account for all the hours of disruption, drop in productivity due to the lower engagement, because any type of change is going to have a negative impact on the employees. You know, is my boss going to change? Am I going to report to the same person? Am I going to have a change in my team? How's this going to impact my work-life balance? How's this going to impact this? So all these questions are really going to be on the table until the organization settles. So we need to account for all these costs, you know, and there are ways to do it. You know, most of the time I recommend to my clients to look into the internal benchmark rather than to try to source this from consultants. You know your organization better than anybody. You know your people better than anybody. So I'm quite sure you can look back into instance of time where you have had a similar change, and you can figure out the cost implication, especially with a temporal distance, you know, of several months or a year. You'll be able to really understand and grasp all the costs associated. So change in a technology, change in processes, change in people's compensation, levels of management. All this needs to be added up to a particular figure so your C-level executives can see the big picture and make the decision. And then implementation risks. You know, as I said, this is usually a very political environment. So you got to make sure that you understand all the ramifications, that you fight only the necessary battles, and ultimately you make sure that you align people around the cause. So yeah, I mean, just to conclude this piece, you know, organizational design success is really going to be driven by your understanding of the technical aspect of it, as well as the political and cultural aspect of it. Make sure that you build alliances, make sure that you plan thoroughly, that you spend enough time, that you have the right resources, that you have the right expertise, and most importantly, have the patience for the transformation to yield results. Some of these changes are not really going to be beneficial short term, but they might have a significant dividend long term. So make sure that you conduct this exercise mid to long term benefit assessment of the design options. So just a quick check-in. Wondering how's this resonating with the audience? Let me see what are the questions. FTE should be performed according to the department's roles, responsibilities, so you can get ideal number of the manpower. Absolutely, and there is a piece that we discuss workforce planning as well as the strategic workforce planning. So that is definitely a very important element of the organizational effectiveness. So it's not about the structure only, it's about also the staffing levels. So how many people do we fit in that structure is gonna be a huge differentiator. So let's look at the next piece, which is the business case for defining enduring organizational objectives. So what do we have to do is make sure that we build it to last. I'm pretty sure many of you came across John Collins, build to last. It's really becoming very, very difficult to be a successful organization over a long period of time. And what really separates success factors from companies that don't get it right is their ability to be pragmatic, to be practical, to really get things done in a fairly simple but effective way, and to plan. Those companies that are better than the others plan. They're really good at it, and we'll talk about it in just a minute. But ultimately, what I would like to share here is the whole fact that, when it comes to a landscape that we're operating in, it's not getting any easier. So here are some facts from the Corporate Executive Board survey. So when it comes to the increase in the change magnitude, so how big is the change ahead? 86% of the HR leaders strongly agree that the change is just gonna increase. It's not gonna get any easier. So when it comes to the decrease in predictability, so I have no issue with the magnitude of the change if I can manage the predictability, but even that is going to increase. So it's going to become increasingly difficult for us in business to understand what the next change is going to look like. I'm pretty sure only like 3-4 months ago, most of us, if we were to hear about this coronavirus, we would be like shrugging our shoulders and like, what the hell is that gonna do with me? But now the reality is totally different. And different kind of change, that's really keeping most of the HR leaders awake. So when you look at these 3 facts, I think as HR, we really gotta scratch our head and think, how's this going to impact our business? So this degree of unpredictability is very much in line with this, VUCA syndrome, so volatility, unpredictability, complexity is really going to go overboard. And how do we manage that effectively? So ultimately, what's going to happen, it's really about your ability to develop, enterprise level perspective on the talent management. So we got to move from looking at as HR as enabler, as a function. We have to look at it from a much more strategic perspective that's really going to help us navigate the change. So that's something that's really close to where we are today. So as an HR, I'm pretty sure right now you're getting all sorts of questions regarding the current situation. Employees are looking to HR for leadership. So making sure that you are able to navigate through the change is really going to make or break a lot of businesses. So your ability to navigate through the change ultimately is going to help you increase the change readiness. So as an organization, not as an organizational unit, getting really good in managing the unpredictability is going to be one of the key success factors. And the other thing that's going to come out of this is your ability to align to enduring objectives. So now it's really, really important to have your mission, vision, and objectives extremely clear and really well articulated, so you can move the organization in the short period of time. And why is this important? Because the simplicity ultimately is the key goal of the organizational effectiveness. In John Collins' Good to Great, it's called hedgehog factor. So you know how the hedgehog defends itself. It just basically crouches, and it makes it difficult for any predator to turn it into a lunch. So great organizations have that, you know, a very simple message for all their employees. In order to be successful, we gotta do 1, 2. That's it, and that's really gonna make us succeed in the environment. So one thing that is quite relevant to the current environment is going to be scenario-based workforce planning and business cases. So here's the catch. You know, in the past, most of us have been looking to a moderate competition. You know, you were competing more or less within your country or the region at best. Now we're operating in the environment defined as hyper competition. Not only that, as a business, you're competing on the global level, you're competing with the incumbents that you did not even deem as your competitors only as far as yesterday. So just the most obvious example, I guess, would be, you know, for those that still remember, you know, VHS tapes and DVDs. You know, it's a story of Blockbuster and Netflix. You know, so Netflix was pitching this whole streaming concept to executives of Blockbuster. They just shrugged them off. They're like, yeah, whatever. We're the juggernaut in this space, and good luck to you. And basically only I believe, like, you know, something like 12 to 18 months, Netflix managed to put a Blockbuster out of business. The interesting fun fact, and I'm pretty sure you knew this story, but I'm not so convinced you know the story about the Sony and Blockbuster. So when Sony came up with this whole VHS concept for the video recorders, they were extremely expensive. And then you can imagine that the price of the videotape at the time was something like $30, $40. So the whole business model was on the edge, if it's going to fly or not, who's going to watch this, who's going to pay this. And then on top of this, you know, technical cost, you also have the proprietary content, which is movies or whatever you're watching on the VHS, so add another $50. So, you know, the price tag for the tape was like around like $80, $100. And that's how the Blockbuster came to play. They realized there is a huge opportunity actually to rent the video cassettes at the time. And that's how they have captured the market from Sony, that pretty much was quite well positioned to dominate that space. But, you know, they overlooked this opportunity, and here is Blockbuster. But, you know, next thing you know, when another moment of disruption came in, they were not ready. So what I'm trying to say here, as a business, especially a business that is keen to become, you know, an effective organization, they need to be aware of these things. They need to understand, you know, that there is a competitor somewhere around the world that's lurking, that's ready to leapfrog into your space and take your market share. So you got to make sure that you plan for that. And that means that your scenario-based business planning needs to become even more agile. So those annual cycles of planning are not necessarily going to be of much good to you down the road. So here is the opportunity for the HR. So here's an interesting survey. Basically, what this tells us is that the business leaders don't necessarily have a full confidence in HR's ability to effectively plan the workforce. And I have seen this firsthand. So many organizations struggle with effective, empirically driven workforce planning. You know, this is also one of those activities in HR next to OD that can be very hazy, very mystical, you know. So how do we figure out how many people we need for the next year? You know, beside trying to see from which side the wind blows, there should be a very strong methodology and approach to understanding the workforce planning. So here is another interesting, point. So a percentage of the hiring managers were asked, you know, how often have you seen peers hire below average candidate just to fill the position? So that's happening across the world. It's not unique to the region. I have seen this day in, day out, and it's really leading to a substandard results in performance, not only of the hiring manager, but also the incumbent. You know, sometimes you would find those candidates coming from the outside being thrown at the deep end of the pool just for the sheer fact that the poor workforce planning led to urgent hires that are really trying to close the gap that was wide open for some time. But now the business need is as such, and we need to act and we need to hire quickly. And that ultimately can undermine the quality of the hire. And the other thing that also happens in these scenarios, due to the lack of the proper workforce planning, we tend to balloon the cost. So just for the sake of getting somebody on board, we tend to be more flexible when it comes to offers. So the salary for the new employee is going to be higher than perhaps for the high performer in that business unit. And that undermines the internal equity and creates a whole myriad of problems. And you know, I have spent endless hours trying to figure out solution to internal pay equity issues that stemmed from this problem. So it's basically a vicious cycle, you know. So lack of proper and agile business planning leads to a lack of the workforce planning, and that leads to you know, ad hoc hiring. This ad hoc hiring would have a negative impact on the internal pay equity, because nothing is as disengaging than a fact that somebody is getting paid more or the same amount of money than somebody with a longer tenure or higher performance. So that is something that really needs to be managed quite effectively. Very interesting part. Thank you. So yeah, how do we avoid that? So really, I think what's at the root here is ability of the organization to increase their line of sight. So start looking strategically at the workforce. You know, try to extend the horizon. Look beyond immediate future of 12 to 24 months. Start to be more strategic. And I think it's really good to go back to a definition. So strategic workforce planning is basically a workforce planning that goes beyond the horizon of 24 months. So anything between, you know, 24 and 48 months would be considered strategic workforce planning. Otherwise, you know, if you're planning just for the next year or 2 years, this is your typical workforce planning that's going to be done on the job level. And your strategic workforce planning is mostly going to look at the critical talent segments. And this is just another very political issue in most of the organizations. Which jobs are critical? So here's a trivia question. I'm really keen to see from the audience, if you don't mind sharing in the chat box, how do you guys determine critical jobs in your organization? So what's a critical job in your books? Let's give it a moment and see what the audience comes back with. So critical jobs. What's a critical job in your company? I'll come back to the methodology for the workforce planning, but I'm just keen to see if you guys can share with me what's the critical job. Yeah, so how do you define the critical job is one of really interesting topics. Yes, the high impact on the business. Exactly. I like that. And what else? Ah, here you go. Diana came up with a textbook definition. So it's a high impact and high level of difficulty to source the job, incumbent for the job. So ultimately, it comes down to building a quadrant. On one side of the quadrant, on one axis, you're going to have the impact, the business impact of that job should it be vacant. So what's going to be the impact on the safety, business continuity, on the revenue, innovation? So those dimensions that define the business impact in your organization are going to be very much unique to your own company. And on the other side of the spectrum, and typically this side of the equation, I would agree on the dimensions with the business leaders, but it's theirs to determine. They know the business better than anybody, and they can quantify the jobs in our organization based on those dimensions. On the other side of the spectrum, we have not only the difficulty to recruit, but difficulty to retain and develop. So that needs to be quantified. Exactly, you know, rare to recruit, difficult to recruit, but also expensive to develop. So just, you know, to give you examples, you know, so developing medical professionals, you know, is not something that happens overnight. So if you have a significant shortage of talent and you don't have a strong pipeline to develop a sustainable workforce, a good example is this pandemic. Now the medical staff is in a high demand everywhere in the world. So the option of recruiting is not necessarily on the table, regardless of how generous the packages are going to be. If every country is struggling with their healthcare system, it might really make you go back to your own resources. And this is not something that can be done overnight. So building the capacity ahead of the time is really critical. So going back to the point of strategic workforce planning, we really need to have this longer horizon in order to be successful in anticipating any gaps and challenges in getting the top talent for the organization in the requisite numbers. So it's not only getting the right level of the talent, it's getting the right quantity. So it comes together, quantity and quality of the talent need to be on the map. So typically what's happening in terms of the current scenarios, as I have suggested, you know, most of the HR departments would have, you know, a very short horizon, and this ultimately does not yield the best results. So we need to look at the options of extending the horizon. There was one question in regards to the approach to the workforce planning. Ultimately, workforce planning is not that difficult. It's all about demand and supply. So your demand is going to be driven by the business. So as a healthcare institution, most of the business demand is going to be triggered by the environment that we are operating in. So in terms of geography, what are the prevalent you know, issues from the medical and healthcare perspective that the hospital is dealing with? What type of healthcare institution are we working with? And what is the size and the scope of the institution? So those are the manpower drivers. On the other side, you're gonna have the workforce supply, and this is typically an empirical exercise that is developed on the net growth of the workforce. So how many employees are you expecting to have in year 3, year 4, year 5, minus the attrition, be it voluntary, involuntary attrition, as well as the retirements. And basically what you will look at as a business is to find a way how to close that gap between the supply and demand. And that brings me to my next point, which is this needs to be articulated within the particular business scenario. So you can build the workforce plan against a single future. And let's call it your perfect case scenario. Everything's fine, you know, the business is doing well. We are managing this on a day-to-day in a very, very solid and traditional fashion. That's really not going to be good enough, because ultimately what you need to do as a business is you need to plan for the multiple futures. So typically what we do with our clients, we introduce the scenario planning, and I think it's quite relevant. Most of the scenario planning is either sitting with the strategy or the business continuity departments. But I personally believe, I'm very passionate about this piece. I believe that there is a room for scenario planning in HR. And I really believe that especially HR leadership needs to become very proficient in managing scenario planning for two sheer facts. It's really going to help you challenge the strategic assumptions. So if you look at the scenario planning from a very pragmatic perspective, you as an HR will be in a really good shape to challenge the strategy for the better. And at the same time, the decision-making process is going to improve. On the other side, it's going to improve the strategic decision-making process. Why? Because if we are just complicit and we don't challenge the status quo, we basically just accept the direction coming from the top echelon of the organization or the strategy department, or whoever is the driving force in your organization. If we as an HR don't stand, the ground, we don't challenge it in a constructive way, meaning that we really need to have a very solid case, we need to have a science behind us, we need to have the numbers, and we can bring value by challenging the status quo. That's really going to drive the best results. So typically what I do with my clients, I work with them for scenarios. So I look at the possible scenarios. So as a business, what is a possible scenario? What's a from to, like, is it possible, that as a business, we can expect an increase in the volume of orders 10 times? Yeah, it's possible. Then I look at the scenario that's plausible, so it's, on the realm of out there, it is, possible to expect that this is, one of those black swans that can happen. It's plausible, that we shut down because unplanned event. It's plausible that, we really win a jackpot and we are the guys that actually develop respirators in 2020 January, and now everybody wants to buy them. So it's plausible. Then you have a most likely scenario. So the scenario that is very likely to occur. And you have a preferred scenario. So that's a scenario that is the rosiest scenario that all of us would like us to see happen. So typically what happens in the scenario planning exercise, we would put on the map 4 scenarios, but when it comes to the detailed planning, we typically look at the most likely scenario, and based on the conversation we would have with the leadership, we would pick either a preferred scenario or, a possible scenario for the other side of the extreme. So out of 4 scenarios that are developed on the narrative level, we would go ahead and we would develop a detailed workforce plans that would give the organization kind of a fallback, a contingency in case this plan comes to reality. So how do you develop scenarios? So ultimately, what you're looking for is to identify internal and external factors, and you want to plot them against these 4 quadrants: high uncertainty and low impact. That's really not going to be a big headache for anybody. It's not certain. You just keep an eye on those factors. And low uncertainty, low impact, that's really not going to be on the radar. Then you have the low uncertainty and high impact factors, but those are quite easy to manage. So that they will happen for sure because they're in the realm of low uncertainty. So the degree of certainty that these factors will come to reality is quite high, and they have a high impact, so you can really account for it. An example would be perhaps, a regulatory change. So for instance, introduction of the VAT, you know, we all knew it's coming, you know, it has a high impact on the business perhaps, but we knew it's coming, so we could plan accordingly. The box that you really need to watch for is high uncertainty, high impact. So those are the you know, elements that you really need to account for in your critical scenario drivers. So what are those drivers that can have a huge impact on your business? So typically the way I would plot it, I would look into internal and external factors. So most often in the recent times, when it comes to the internal factors that has a high degree of uncertainty and high impact would be a digital transformation. So many companies are actually moving forward with the massive investments when it comes to digital transformation with a high degree of uncertainty. You know, the judgment is yet to be passed of how successful and what degree of return on investment on those digital transformation initiatives are we yet to experience. And at the same time, it has a huge impact on the organization. So basically, you would try to work out a session with your leaders, with your SMEs, and try to figure out what are those internal drivers and how would you plot them against these four quadrants. At the same time, you start looking outside of the window, what's happening in the world, what's happening in the region, and you try to figure out what are the factors that will impact your business that are external. So fluctuation in the commodity prices, you know, geopolitical issues, climate, business change, business environment change, disruption. So you would figure out what are those elements that can have an impact on your business, and then you stretch them to extreme. So let's say that one of the external drivers is going to be change in the global GDP, and the other one's going to be the digital transformation. So how's this going to give you your four scenarios? Is by looking at the world that's going to have the high GDP and your internal transformation when it comes to digital is successful. So that's going to be quite positive environment. And then you have to describe how's this scenario going to impact your workforce. So my digital transformation is successful and the GDP is going up. So GDP going up means more customers means more demand. So I need to improve my productivity. At the same time, we have went through the digital transformation. That means that a lot of jobs will change. And that needs to be accounted for in your strategic workforce planning. So I have kind of like, you know, given you a bit of a rundown on the scenario planning and how you can use it in your strategic workforce planning, because I hope I'm not losing your attention. I know I've been talking for a long time, but you see how from the organizational effectiveness, you start obviously with your strategy, you start looking at your governance model, you start looking at your organizational design. Then the next question is, you know, how many people do we need in this organization? Sure, against which business scenario are we building and planning? And now we can move to the next chapter, which is future of work. And this is where all the fun is. This is where all the strategic minds, you know, come together. So understanding how the tomorrow in the office is going to look like is really important in organizational effectiveness. Because as I said, it's really important to plan for tomorrow. You got to anticipate the problems you need to solve tomorrow, not the problems from yesterday. You know, that's not going to give you a head start in this game. So what the business is going to look like based on the CEO survey run by the corporate executive board is, you know, that the competition is just going to get more agile, you know. So here are the key 5 insights from the survey. So the CEOs and the chief HR officers believe that the trend most disrupting their organization is changing customer expectations. So customers are getting really smart. They're getting really educated in terms of what they expect from you as a business, how they want to consume the services, and that's leading to a really severe disruption in some of the sectors, you know, more, you know, than the others. Over half of the organizations surveyed are looking to increase the size of their workforce, and 70% of the CEOs and chief HR officers want to push decision-making down the hierarchy. So this is another trend that is very much driven by the changing business landscape, because the environment we operate is quite complex, and it's becoming inherently difficult for the executives to make all the decisions. They want to build an organization that's going to be sustainable, that's going to have capable lieutenants, that employees at every level are going to be smart and entrepreneurially driven, that will make the best decision for the organization. For some, a pipe dream, for some reality, and it has to do a lot with the culture. The third driver of the future of work is going to be organizations, are facing automation risks. So how are you going to transform, to meet the technology evolution of tomorrow? 74% of the CEOs and 62% of the chief HR officers believe there is a business need or responsibility to invest in retraining employees. So we have seen what's happening now around the world. A lot of employees are made redundant. And I think if companies have paid closer attention to their capabilities to quickly retrain, repurpose their workforce, this kind of fluctuation in terms of the size of the workforce would not be necessary. Just a fun fact, I've been talking to some colleagues in China. Apparently, they even have furniture manufacturing companies now producing medical supplies. So go figure. So I guess, they're quite good in repurposing their businesses. And the last driver is around the majority of the chief HR officers expecting competition for critical talent to increase. And I think this is quite relevant because, good people are hard to find and they are in high demand regardless of the industry. So these are going to be one of the most precious assets of any organization, be that you are looking at a startup or rebuilding your business capability. Making sure that you have the right know-how is going to be extremely important. I believe we have only 10 minutes left, and we still have quite a bit of content that's not covered. But again, I'm really sorry for that, but we have only so much time. I would be more than delighted if given the opportunity to join you again. I would like to open this remaining time for questions. If there is something that is really of interest to you to explore further, I'm more than happy to discuss. It would be great if the admins can open mics for some of the audience so they can ask questions. I think it's going to be a bit more interactive rather than to listen to myself. Yeah, I think it's really making a lot of sense to wrap it up here, because we still have like 60 slides. I don't think it would do us much good to go over the rest of them that quickly. Yeah, real pleasure. I'm hoping that this session gave you some interesting perspectives and valuable insights. Yeah, I'll share slides. Yeah, I'll prepare. Give me not necessarily tomorrow morning. I'll need some time to sanitize them, but I will make sure that we share the material we have discussed. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it. How do you link OD and core competency impact? Yeah, I think that's quite obvious. So when it comes to the core competencies, I would imagine you're talking about core competencies of the people. When you look at the STAR model, this whole piece around the people is about aligning the competencies with the processes, with the level in the organization, as well as rewards. So that piece is an intricate element of the organizational design framework. Anything else before we wrap the session? Would you elaborate more?
Yeah,
Go
I think
ahead.
Ruqayya is unmuted. She can ask question. Or
Please
Roj,
go ahead.
please, Mr. Roj or Ruqayya.
Yeah, can I ask? I don't know whether am I audible?
Roj, yeah, you can ask.
Okay. This is Rocky. First of all, Paul, thank you so much. Paul, this looks too good on paper. Now, when was the real implementation done in Saudi, I would ask?
I'm currently servicing several clients in Saudi Arabia, and most of them are, prime organizations. So everything that I have shared with you is the life I live. Not only that I work as a partner for Agile Dynamics, I also work as a subject matter expert for several consultancies in HR as well as the management consulting space. So we work with the likes of K-Care, Saudi, Chevron, number of other organizations that I'm not at liberty to share now because I don't know who's on the other side. But definitely, this is what the organizations really need and are ready to invest in, and most importantly, companies that get it right reap massive benefits.
Yeah, but then implementation was done, and what was literally the ROI promised and ROI delivered?
Massive. To give you an example from the nuclear industry, strategic workforce planning in the nuclear industry can yield an ROI of 700%, measuring in tens of millions of dollars per year. So making sure that you have the right number of people doing the right thing is critical, because in the nuclear industry, 70% of the operating cost is the total cost of the workforce. So having too many or too few people is really going to jeopardize the operations of the organization, ultimately the revenue and dividends for the shareholders. So strategic workforce and the scenario planning that I've been talking about, I have successfully implemented several times with the massive return on investment.
But was it backed by right hiring?
Of course, that's the part of it.
Yeah,
so
that's a critical part of it, because the entire planning happens, but when you really do the hiring on the ground, this is something else.
Of course. So you can't really offer the half-baked goods to your stakeholders. So ultimately, not only that we define what you need to hire for, we also define how much you need to hire for and how much you should pay for those hires. So you get really straightforward input in terms of what needs to be done. Then it comes down to talent acquisition and recruitment execution. So absolutely, we have done the right thing for our clients, and clients were capable of executing very effectively.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And I was just wondering about the best way to do the workforce plan, because as I hear there is a 5 or 4 methodology to do it.
So that's on the organizational design. On the workforce planning, I have not gone into a detail, but more than happy to take it offline and to share some material with you. And ultimately, it starts with getting a bit of technical understanding how this is done. And then if some support is required, I'm more than delighted to help out on this topic. This is my core expertise.
Yes, please. If you can share with me your email.
Yeah. Absolutely. Get in touch with the administrators, and they'll provide you my contact.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you
just
all.
For everybody, to say,
Thank you.
I'm definitely happy to help. So if this is not going to be a significant consumption of time, if you have some questions, I'm happy to help, and also to share some material, and you can get it done yourself. I'm more than delighted to support you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. That was the last question from our participant. I hope that all of our participants have a benefit from this session. Thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge in the organization effectiveness, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. Cheers. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.